What if a simple family photo held a secret no one was meant to find? What if a missing child was never truly gone? And what happens when a face appears, one that no one remembers, one that doesn't belong? Not a ghost, not a trick of the light, but something else. Would you still keep the photo? Or would you dare to look closer? If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. In the summer of 1915, in a quiet township nestled along the wooded valleys of Pennsylvania, the days passed in stillness. The war in Europe echoed faintly across the ocean, barely brushing the routines of the rural families who tilled soil, raised children, and preserved customs with quiet resolve. In one such family, the Millers, life unfolded in modest harmony. Their home, a whitewashed farmhouse trimmed with ivy, stood at the edge of a thicket where children were warned not to wander. Helen, age 9, and her brother Walter, 11, were forbidden to play beyond the tree line, and yet, like most children, they often did. That August, under a washed-out sun, their father decided to capture a photograph. He'd borrowed a camera from a neighbor, one of those boxy, temperamental devices with a cloudy lens and a stiff tripod. The moment was mundane. Helen in her Sunday dress, Walter in suspenders too large for his frame. They stood side by side in the backyard, barefoot on dry grass. Behind them, a crooked apple tree sagged with overripe fruit. Their expressions were solemn, almost rehearsed, though Helen allowed herself a faint smile, the sort that flickered only in the final seconds before the shutter snapped. The photograph was printed weeks later in town. It was carefully stored in a leather-bound album, along with others, some faded, some blurred by time and light. Nothing about it, at the time, seemed remarkable. Just two children, pausing for a brief instant, surrounded by the textures of an ordinary life, the warped fence in the background, the rusted watering can, the outline of the shed half lost in shadow. Years passed. The album followed the family through decades, migrations, marriages, and funerals. It gathered dust in an attic, then later rested in a cedar trunk sealed beneath quilts. Generations came and went, and the photograph, like so many others, became an artifact stripped of story, until it reached Abigail Miller, great-granddaughter of Helen, who inherited the trunk after the death of her father in 2013. She was an archivist by profession, drawn to old things, brittle papers, vanished names. It was during a slow autumn weekend that she began scanning the family photographs, digitizing each one with meticulous care. She had no reason to pause on that particular image. Nothing about it suggested a mystery, and yet something unsettled her. Not immediately, but slowly, like a draft from a door left ajar. She would later describe it as a kind of dissonance, a feeling that the photo contained more than it should, or perhaps something that resisted being seen all at once. The children were clear, their posture precise, but the background, specifically the space between the apple tree and the edge of the fence, appeared strangely inconsistent. The grain thickened there, the shadows gathered with unusual weight. She enlarged the image, just enough to study the folds in Helen's dress, the smudge on Walter's knee. Then, a little more. The backyard became a blur of silver and gray. And then, in the area partially obscured by foliage, she saw it. At first, it seemed like a blemish, a ripple in the emulsion. But it wasn't. It had contour, depth, the suggestion of eyes. She blinked, reoriented, adjusted contrast, cropped, zoomed again. There, among the tangled weeds and shaded earth, was a face, pale, elongated, unmoving, and as she would later insist, one that did not belong. Abigail did not sleep well that night. The face in the photograph, once noticed, refused to retreat into the realm of innocent oversight. It hovered in her thoughts with a strange insistence, not merely as a curiosity, but as an intrusion. She had examined hundreds of antique images in her life, many of them marred by time, double exposures, or chemical imperfections. But this was different. The clarity of it was undeniable, and yet its presence was entirely without context. She returned to the scan the next morning, convinced that sleep might lend her clarity. Instead, it only deepened the question. She zoomed in again, slowly. The face, half concealed in brush and dappled shadow, remained where it had been. It was not blurred or indistinct like the background around it. It was rendered with unsettling precision. The eyes appeared slightly too wide, the mouth set in a neutral line, devoid of expression. It did not smile. It did not frown. It simply stared, as if waiting to be recognized. No one else in the family had mentioned it before. No notes, no scribbles on the back of the photo, no family lore attached to that particular afternoon. She contacted her aunt, the last living daughter of Walter Miller, who remembered very little beyond vague references to the old backyard. When shown the image, the woman narrowed her eyes, leaned closer, and asked, "Is that someone standing there?" But before Abigail could respond, she dismissed it with a shrug. Probably a neighbor, or some hired help. People used to wander in and out all the time. But Abigail was not satisfied. She pulled the census records from 1910 and 1920. She charted the layout of the neighborhood from old fire insurance maps. She compared the known faces of the family from other photographs in the same album. The face did not match any of them. It belonged to no uncle, no cousin, no farmhand, and its height, if standing as it appeared, was odd. It was too tall for a child, too slender for a grown man. Its positioning also defied logic. There was no visible path leading to that corner of the yard, no footprints in the grass, no disturbance in the weeds, and yet, there it was. Abigail began to lose time. Hours passed unnoticed as she stared into the grayscale image, alternating between analytical focus and something less rational, an intuitive dread, difficult to name. She searched through local newspapers from that summer, hoping to anchor the mystery to something concrete. Most headlines spoke of harvests, civic parades, whispers of war abroad. But buried in a late June edition of the Greene County Register, she found a short column titled "Boy Missing Near Oak Hollow." No photograph accompanied the article, just 3 paragraphs. The boy's name was Samuel Cartwright, age 10. Last seen playing near the woods at the edge of his family's property, less than a quarter mile from the Millers' home. The article stated he had wandered off sometime after supper. A search party combed the area for 3 days. Dogs were brought in. No trace was found. No clothing, no tracks, no sound. Authorities speculated he may have fallen into a nearby ravine or been taken by a drifter, though no evidence supported either theory. His parents moved away the following winter. Abigail reread the column multiple times. She enlarged the clipping, compared the date with the Miller photograph, taken in August, 2 months after the disappearance. She found no record of the Millers being questioned. That night, she printed the face, isolated it, pinned it beside her desk. Its lack of emotion unsettled her more than any scream could have. It did not look lost. It did not look frightened. It looked still, present, and increasingly aware. The name Samuel Cartwright lingered like residue. Abigail found herself whispering it without meaning to, mouthing the syllables in idle moments as though invoking it might unlock something. His story, brief and unsatisfying in the archives, began to swell in her mind. A child gone without trace in early summer. No resolution, no body, no farewell. Only absence, and a growing suspicion that his vanishing had not been accidental. She scoured regional archives, libraries, digitized microfilm, obituaries. There was no follow-up article, no renewed investigation, no vigil. It was as if the town had agreed, quietly and collectively, to forget. The Cartwrights themselves seemed to dissolve after that point. No census records, no employment logs, no church rosters. By spring of the following year, their house was reportedly sold for less than half its value to a man who never moved in. No one ever occupied it again. It stood empty for years before it burned under unexplained circumstances in 1923. A single line in the register marked the event. No injuries, no cause determined. Abigail requested photographs of Samuel, but only one could be located. A school portrait from the fall of 1914, preserved in a yearbook brittle with age. He was a thin child with dark hair combed stiffly to one side, eyes slightly downcast, mouth tight. It was not a strong match, and yet something about the structure of his face, the narrow jaw, the arched brow, recalled the figure in the backyard. She overlaid the images, adjusted opacity, aligned the features. The resemblance, while not conclusive, refused to be dismissed. There was a harmony of shape, a persistence of gaze. She reached out to a retired forensic analyst, someone she had once worked with during a university archival project. He agreed to examine the photograph and the portrait, offering his opinion by phone 2 weeks later. His voice was cautious. "I can't say definitively," he said, "but if I had to testify, I'd say the probability of it being the same individual is uncomfortably high. Given the time period, the limitations of image quality, well, let's just say I wouldn't bet against it." Abigail asked what he meant by uncomfortably. He paused. "Because that boy disappeared 2 months before the photo was taken. And if that's him in the picture, then either the date is wrong or someone's lying." But the date wasn't wrong. Abigail had already verified the stamp on the back of the print, the camera model, the development logs. It had been taken in August, and there was no sign the photo had been altered. The face wasn't superimposed. There were no cut edges, no paste marks, no inconsistencies in grain or exposure. She began to dream of the backyard, not as it was in the photo, but as it might have been, surrounded by long grass, isolated by trees that leaned in too closely. In the dreams, she was a child, barefoot, standing beside Helen and Walter, the shutter counting down, and always, before the flash, movement behind her. Not loud, just a shift, a slow exhale, a presence in the weeds. She started checking the photograph each morning, as if it might change overnight, but the face remained, unmoving, not faded, not distorted, just there. And then something else occurred to her, a detail she hadn't noticed before. The figure's head was tilted, not downward or to the side, but slightly forward, the way someone might lean to be seen, as though it knew a photograph was being taken, as though it wanted to be remembered. There had always been 2 photographs. Abigail discovered the second print tucked behind the first, pressed together so tightly that decades had fused their corners. At first glance, it seemed identical, the same backyard, the same children, the same slant of sun. But as she studied it, the differences emerged, subtle, insistent, and deeply wrong. In this version, Helen's hands were clasped more tightly, her posture slightly stiffer. Walter's eyes looked elsewhere, not at the camera, but slightly to his left, as if distracted in the moment before the shutter fell. The shadows were longer, the light dimmer, but it was the background that held Abigail in place, her breath caught between heartbeat and silence. The face was no longer in the same spot. It had moved, slightly, but undeniably. In the first image, it lingered behind the apple tree, half submerged in weeds. In the second, it had shifted leftward, closer to the children, its head angled further forward, now emerging more clearly from the brush. The shape was the same, the expression unchanged, but the proximity had altered the mood entirely. There was now an implication of intent, of pursuit. Abigail stared at both images for hours, toggling between them like frames of a slow, silent film. She measured distances, compared landmarks, the tree trunk, the fence post, the shed. Everything else was consistent, only the figure had moved, and yet she could not explain how. These were static moments, frozen forever in emulsion. Movement should not be possible. She sent both images to a photography expert in Vermont, an academic known for authenticating Civil War-era daguerreotypes. His reply was swift and clinical. No signs of tampering, no evidence of double exposure. The negatives, he said, were consistent with photographic processes of the time. "If these are fakes," he wrote, "they are the most sophisticated I've encountered in 20 years. But I don't believe they are. These are real, which is perhaps more troubling." Abigail returned to her notes, her maps, the timelines. She combed through everything again, seeking a rational thread. She found none. But what she did find, buried in the Miller family letters from the autumn of 1915, was a brief mention that chilled her. A postcard from Helen's mother to a cousin in Ohio, dated October 12th. The handwriting was delicate, looping, but the words were plain. "The children are well, though Helen says she sometimes hears someone in the yard at night. She's begun leaving the window shut." No further elaboration, no reply that referenced it. But the postcard had never been discarded. It was kept, preserved in the same trunk as the photographs. Abigail began to notice other things, small, Seemingly inconsequential details, a crack in the window of her study that hadn't been there before, a rustling outside her apartment on windless nights, the hum of electricity cutting out just as she approached the desk where the images were kept. The rational part of her mind catalogued each occurrence, attributed them to stress, to coincidence, but the rest of her, the part that had always trusted what others dismissed, began to listen more carefully. There was one final detail in the second photograph that she had missed at first, a blur, low in the corner, almost lost in the grain. She enhanced it cautiously, not hoping for clarity, only for shape. It was a hand, not belonging to Helen, not to Walter. It was reaching forward, from the same direction as the face, fingers outstretched, and it was closer than it should have been. It was late November when Abigail stopped answering calls. Friends assumed she had taken time off work. Her colleagues at the archive said she had been quiet, more withdrawn, but not unlike her usual temperament. She had always been private, always immersed in something. But after the last email, subject line, "They're not photographs," nothing more came. The apartment was found in order, no signs of forced entry, no struggle. The photographs were gone, the digital copies deleted. Her computer wiped clean except for a single folder labeled Backyard. Inside it, a text file of notes, fragmented, obsessive, and dated up to the night she vanished. The final entry read only, "It's not that he was there, it's that he waited." The investigation yielded little. No signs of foul play, no travel activity, no sightings. One neighbor reported hearing soft knocking from Abigail's door in the early morning hours on several occasions, but assumed it was a delivery. Another recalled hearing a child's voice, distant, almost submerged, singing a tune she could not place. When police followed up, they found nothing. Her disappearance was classified as voluntary absence. Months passed. Winter receded. Spring brought closure only in the form of forgetting. The building was sold, her belongings dispersed to relatives. The cedar trunk that had once held the Miller album was misplaced during the move, or perhaps discarded. No one could say for sure. And yet, in March of the following year, a man named Garrett Whitmore, a used book dealer in Delaware, contacted a local radio station to share a peculiar find. He had purchased a box of ephemera from an estate sale, maps, postcards, black and white photographs. Among them, he claimed, were two prints dated 1915, nearly identical, depicting two children in a yard. What drew his attention was not the children, but the background. A figure, faint but present, unmistakable. He said he didn't keep the photographs, claimed he gave them to a collector of oddities who never responded to follow-ups. He couldn't recall the collector's name, couldn't provide proof of the sale. When asked to describe the figure, he hesitated, said it didn't look like a person. Not exactly. It was more like an echo of one, he said, like something remembering how to be human. No further record of the photographs exists. As for the Miller house, what remained of it was leveled in 1974 after decades of abandonment. Local children had long called it the listening house, though no one remembers why. The land is vacant now. Nothing grows there. No birds nest in its trees. No paths cross it, though it's not fenced. People who live nearby speak little of it. But sometimes, on still days, with no wind and no traffic, there are those who claim to hear something faint, a voice, high and dry, repeating the same question over and over again, not calling for help, just asking, softly, "Did you see me?"